In 713 AD, a monk climbed to the top of a cliff in central China and looked down at the river below. Three rivers met at the base of that cliff, the Min, the Dadu, and the Qingyi. Where they converged, the water churned into something violent, whirlpools that could swallow boats whole, currents that changed direction without warning, a confluence so dangerous that the stretch of river below this particular cliff had killed so many boatmen, so many merchants, so many ordinary people trying to cross, that the local people had stopped counting the dead and simply accepted the water as something that took. The monk stood at the top of the cliff and made a decision. He was going to carve a god into the mountain, not a small statue, not a shrine, not a temple built against the rock face, a god carved from the mountain itself. A seated Buddha figure so large that when completed, a person could stand on his thumbnail. A figure so tall that the seated height alone would be 233 feet, taller than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch, taller than any statue on Earth had ever been. It would take 90 years to complete. The monk who began it died before it was finished. And here is the thing that keeps me awake at night. It worked, not metaphorically, not symbolically, not in the sense that people felt better about the river because a god was watching it. It actually worked. When the builders carved the Buddha from the cliff, they removed so much rock that the debris they dumped into the river permanently altered the hydraulic dynamics of the confluence. The whirlpools diminished. The dangerous currents became navigable. The killing stretch of water became crossable. A monk wanted to calm a river. He carved a mountain into a god, and the carving of the god calmed the river. The Buddha and the hydraulic engineering were the same thing. The faith and the physics were the same thing. That is the story of Leshan. And it begins, as all the strangest true stories do, with one person standing at the edge of something dangerous, deciding that the answer is impossible, and doing it anyway. This is the giant Buddha of Leshan, and nothing about it is what you expect. Sichuan province in central China is one of the most fertile and most geographically dramatic regions on Earth. It is a basin, the Sichuan Basin, ringed by mountains on all sides. To the west, the Tibetan Plateau rises toward altitudes where the air is too thin to breathe comfortably. To the north, the Qinling Mountains form a barrier that shapes the climate, keeping the basin warmer and wetter than the surrounding highlands. To the south and east, further ranges complete the enclosure, creating an interior world with its own weather, its own ecology, its own particular quality of light. The basin itself is watered by a complex river system that drains from the surrounding mountains toward the Yangtze. The rivers carry snowmelt from the Tibetan Plateau, rainfall from the mountain slopes, and the accumulated water of a watershed that extends across thousands of miles. They are powerful rivers, ancient rivers. Rivers that have been shaping this landscape since before anything in it was named. The city of Leshan sits at a point where three of these rivers converge. The Min River comes from the north, draining the mountains above Chengdu. The Dadu River comes from the west, carrying glacial meltwater from the high Tibetan ranges. The Qingyi River comes from the southwest, threading through a landscape of limestone gorges and subtropical forest. Where they meet, the water does what water always does when multiple powerful currents intersect. It becomes complicated. The three bodies of water, each with its own velocity, its own temperature, its own sediment load, collide and interact in ways that create hydraulic features no single river produces alone. Whirlpools form and dissolve and reform. Underwater shoals shift with the seasons. The surface of the water looks calm in places where the subsurface is chaos. For most of recorded Chinese history, this confluence was known as one of the most dangerous stretches of water in Sichuan. The boats that traveled these rivers, carrying silk and salt and grain and people between the interior of China and the broader trade networks of the Tang dynasty, had to navigate this confluence as a matter of course. There was no road that could substitute for the river. If you were moving goods or people through this part of Sichuan, you used the water, and the water killed you. Not always, not everyone, but often enough, and unpredictably enough, that the risk was simply part of the cost of doing business in this part of the world. Families of boatmen performed rituals before setting out on the water. Merchants prayed at riverside shrines. The local population had developed a whole vocabulary of offerings and observances aimed at propitiating whatever it was that decided, on any given day, whether the water would let you through. It was into this landscape, with its particular combination of natural beauty and specific, quantifiable danger, that a monk named Haitong arrived sometime in the early 8th century. Haitong was from a place called Qingcheng Mountain, one of the sacred Taoist mountains of Sichuan. He had spent years in religious practice, and by the time he arrived at the Leshan confluence, he was recognized as a person of spiritual authority and practical competence. He looked at the cliff above the confluence. He looked at the water below the cliff. He made his decision. He would ask for donations to fund the carving. He would organize the labor. He would supervise the work. And if anyone obstructed him, if any government official tried to divert the donated funds for other purposes, he would demonstrate his conviction in the only way that would make the point unmistakably clear. But that story comes later. First, let's understand what he was proposing to build. Numbers are easy to say and hard to feel. Let me try to make the scale of the Leshan Buddha felt rather than merely stated. The figure is seated, in the posture of meditation, hands on knees, eyes looking down toward the river. The seated height is 71 meters. That is 233 feet. For comparison, the Statue of Liberty from base of pedestal to torch tip is 305 feet. From ground to torch, she is taller. But the Statue of Liberty's torch is extended above her head. Her actual seated body, from base to crown of her head, is approximately 151 feet. The Leshan Buddha, seated, is 233 feet. If the Statue of Liberty were sitting down, the Leshan Buddha would be taller. The shoulders of the figure are 92 feet wide. You could park approximately 15 cars side by side across his shoulders. The head alone is 48 feet from chin to crown. You could stack 4 adult men standing on each other's shoulders and still not reach from the chin to the top of the head. The ears are 23 feet long. The nose is 18 feet long. The eyebrows are 18 feet long. The feet, resting on a ledge at the base of the cliff, are 28 feet long. You could hold a dinner party on one foot. The figure is made of red sandstone, the same red sandstone that forms the cliff from which it was carved. Not assembled from blocks, not cast from bronze, carved. The figure is the mountain. The mountain is the figure. They are the same material, the same geological event that deposited this particular sandstone in this particular cliff face. The same rock that Haitong's workers approached with their chisels and hammers and whatever scaffolding they could rig on the face of a vertical cliff over the confluence of 3 dangerous rivers. At the time of its completion, around 803 AD, it was the largest Buddha statue in the world. It held that distinction for over 1,000 years. It still holds it among stone statues. Among all statues made of any material, it remains one of the largest figures ever created. And the most remarkable thing about the scale is not the numbers. The most remarkable thing is what the scale does to you when you experience it. The Buddha at Leshan is carved into a cliff that rises from the riverbank. You approach it by boat. As the boat moves down the river toward the confluence, the cliff comes into view first, the red sandstone face of Mount Lingyan rising above the water. Then, as you get closer, you begin to see that part of the cliff is different. The color is the same. The material is the same, but the shape is different. There is form in the rock that is not geological. Then the form resolves. The head appears, the ears, the shoulders, the seated body, the hands on the knees, the feet on the ledge above the water. And then you realize how far away you still are, and how large the figure already is, and you understand with your body rather than your mind that this is not a statue you are looking at in the usual sense. It is a landscape feature. It is a geographical fact. It is present in the way that mountains are present, not as a made thing, but as a given condition of the world. The boats pass beneath the feet. The feet are above the boat's mast. The scale of the figure relative to the scale of a human being watching from a boat is not the scale of art. It is the scale of geology. This was intentional. Haitong did not want to make a large statue. He wanted to make something large enough that anyone approaching the confluence by river would feel that something vast was watching. Something larger than the river. Something larger than the danger. Something that put the water, with all its killing capacity, in a context where it was simply one element in a world presided over by an attention that was not human in its dimensions. He succeeded. 900 years after its completion, travelers on the Leshan River still describe the same thing, the same moment of scale comprehension, the same shift from seeing a statue to feeling a presence. He built something that was still working long after everyone who built it was dead. There is a story about Haitong that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of person who could begin a project that would take 90 years to complete. While Haitong was soliciting donations for the project, a local government official approached him. The official wanted a portion of the donated funds diverted to government purposes. This was not unusual in Tang Dynasty China. Officials had considerable power over large projects in their jurisdiction, and the line between taxation and corruption was often unclear. Haitong refused. The official pressed him, made clear that refusal had consequences, that a man without government support for a project of this scale was a man who would find his project obstructed at every turn. Haitong's response has been recorded in the historical sources. He said that he would sooner gouge out his own eyes than allow the donated funds to be misused. The official, presumably accustomed to dealing with people who spoke in metaphors and backed down, pressed again. Haitong gouged out his own eyes, on the spot, and presented them to the official on a plate. The official was so horrified that he left immediately and never interfered with the project again. This story is probably not entirely literal. The hagiographic tradition in Chinese Buddhism includes many stories of extreme physical self-sacrifice as demonstrations of spiritual resolve, and they are not all meant to be understood as historical fact in the modern sense. But the story is told because it captures something true about Haitong as a historical figure and about the kind of conviction that the project required. Building the largest statue in the world on the face of a cliff above a dangerous river in the 8th century with hand tools and rope scaffolding was not a project that a person of moderate conviction could sustain. It required someone who had made the decision so completely, so irreversibly, that no obstacle could produce reconsideration. The story of the eyes, whether literal or symbolic, communicates exactly this. Haitong was past the point of negotiation. He had given everything he had to give. The project was not something he was doing. It was something he was. He died before the project was completed. This is not unusual for projects of this scale in the ancient and medieval world. The builders of the great cathedrals of Europe knew they would not see their work finished. The designers of the grandest Chinese temples worked within a tradition that understood construction as a transmission across generations rather than an individual achievement. What Haitong passed on when he died was not just a partially completed statue. It was a project with enough momentum, enough spiritual authority, enough practical organization to survive his absence Two governors of the prefecture continued the work after his death. The project found patrons. The project found workers. The project found, across a span of 90 years, enough sustained human commitment to be completed. That sustained commitment is itself a kind of miracle. Organizations don't usually sustain 90-year projects without the charismatic founder who began them. The fact that this one did tells you something about the quality of what Haitong had built before he died. Not the statue, which was far from finished, but the community of purpose around the project. The shared understanding of what it was for and why it mattered. He built the belief in the project so solidly that the project survived him. The statue came later. The human architecture came first. And there is one more thing about Haitong that deserves attention. He was right. Not just about the spiritual significance of the project, not just about the psychological effect of a massive Buddha figure on the people who navigated the dangerous confluence. He was right about the hydraulics. He understood, in some way that our historical sources don't fully explain, that removing the right amount of rock from the cliff face would change the behavior of the water below. Whether he understood this as physics or as metaphysics, whether he thought of it as engineering or as prayer, is a question the historical record cannot answer with certainty, but the effect was real. The rock removed during the carving of the Buddha was dumped into the river, and the river changed. That makes Haitong one of the most interesting figures in the history of human interaction with the natural world. A person who used the vocabulary of religion to accomplish something that we would now call environmental engineering, and who may or may not have known that those two things were the same. The carving of the Leshan Buddha was not simply the removal of rock from a cliff face. It was a project of extraordinary engineering complexity, executed over 9 decades on a vertical surface above an active and dangerous river. Let's start with the scaffolding. To carve a 233-foot figure on a vertical cliff face, you need to be able to reach every part of that face. You need platforms at the height of the head, at the height of the shoulders, at the height of the chest, the knees, the feet. You need to be able to move between these levels while carrying tools and removing debris. You need the scaffolding itself to be stable enough to work on while hanging over a river confluence that is actively trying to kill people who enter it without care. There was no steel. There was no prefabricated modular scaffolding system. There were bamboo poles, ropes made from plant fibers, wooden planks, and whatever anchoring could be achieved by drilling into the rock face. Bamboo scaffolding is not primitive. In contemporary Asia, bamboo scaffolding is still used for certain types of construction work, including work on high-rise buildings, because bamboo has a strength-to-weight ratio that makes it highly competitive with steel in certain applications. A well-constructed bamboo scaffold can support significant weight, flex rather than break under load, and be assembled without heavy machinery. But there is a difference between using bamboo scaffolding to work on the exterior of a building and using it to work on the face of a vertical cliff above a turbulent river. The anchor points are different. The exposure to wind is different. The consequences of failure are different. The workers at Leshan were hanging on bamboo and rope above water that regularly killed experienced boatmen. They were doing this for 9 decades. The number of workers who died during construction is not recorded in the historical sources. But the scale of the project, the duration, the conditions, and the basic mathematics of risk suggest that the human cost of building the Leshan Buddha was significant. There is something uncomfortable about that, something that the celebratory framing of the statue as a monument to Buddhist compassion sits uneasily alongside. The building of an object intended to save lives on the river cost lives in its construction. This tension is not unique to Leshan. It runs through the history of great construction projects everywhere. The Great Wall of China, the cathedrals of medieval Europe, the pyramids of Egypt, the infrastructure of every ancient empire. The monuments we visit are also the graves of the people who built them. Now, Let's talk about the drainage system. The Leshan Buddha has one of the most sophisticated drainage systems of any ancient sculpture anywhere in the world. The figure's hair is not hair, it is a drainage network. The curls of the Buddha's hair, which appear from a distance to be purely decorative, are actually a carefully designed system of channels that carry rainwater away from the surface of the figure. Without this system, water would pool in the recesses of the carved surface, accelerate erosion, destabilize the rock, and cause the figure to deteriorate far faster than it has. The drainage channels in the hair run to larger channels in the back of the head, which connect to channels in the body, which eventually lead the water to the base of the figure and away from the cliff face. The system works passively, driven by gravity, requiring no maintenance beyond keeping the channels clear. It has been working for over 1,200 years. The ears of the figure are also hollow. This is not immediately obvious from any angle from which you can see the statue. The ears appear solid from the front and sides, but they are in fact hollow wooden structures installed during the original construction that serve as part of the drainage and moisture management system. The wood has been replaced multiple times over the centuries, but the design, the hollow ear chambers that manage moisture on the interior of the head, is original. There are also drainage channels cut into the shoulders, the arms, and the back. The entire figure was designed, from the first cut of the chisel, as a water management system as much as a religious monument. Think about what this means for the construction sequence. The drainage channels had to be planned before the carving began. They had to be incorporated into the overall design at the outset. You cannot carve a 2-3-3-foot figure and then add drainage as an afterthought. The channels have to be in the right places, at the right angles, with the right dimensions to actually carry water away rather than toward vulnerable points. This required a design process that preceded construction, a complete mental model of the finished figure that included not just its visual form but its hydraulic function. Someone, before the first chisel struck the first rock, had thought through where every raindrop that fell on the statue would go, had traced every possible path that water might take across the carved surface, had designed channels to intercept it and conduct it safely away. This is sophisticated engineering. Not sophisticated in the sense of requiring advanced mathematics, though some geometric reasoning was certainly involved. Sophisticated in the sense of requiring a comprehensive understanding of the problem that was being solved, held clearly enough in mind to be translated into a plan that could be executed over 9 decades by multiple generations of workers. The people who built the Leshan Buddha were not naive craftsmen with chisels. They were engineers. They thought systemically. They planned for contingencies. They built something intended to last, and they built it as if they took that intention seriously. Here is the evidence that they did. 1,200 years later, the drainage system still works. The figure still stands. The water still goes where they designed it to go. In a world where most modern buildings are not expected to stand for more than a century, the Leshan Buddha has outlasted every assumption about the durability of human construction by a factor of 12. To understand what the Leshan Buddha meant when it was built, you need to understand the world it was built in. The Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 AD, is considered one of the greatest periods in Chinese history. The period of Haitong's project, the 8th century, was particularly remarkable. Under Emperor Xuanzong, who ruled from 712 to 756, the Tang reached a cultural and economic peak that has rarely been equaled in the subsequent history of any civilization. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was the largest city in the world. Its population is estimated at between 1 and 2 million people. It was a cosmopolitan city in a way that most modern cities do not achieve. Residents included not just Chinese people of various ethnic backgrounds, but Persian merchants, Arab traders, Central Asian musicians, Korean scholars, Japanese monks, Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians, and members of virtually every other religious and ethnic tradition that existed within the broad reach of the Silk Road trade network. Buddhism in Tang China was at the height of its cultural influence. The religion had entered China centuries earlier, traveling along the Silk Road from its origins in the Indian subcontinent, and by the 8th century it had been thoroughly transformed by its encounter with Chinese culture and had in turn transformed Chinese culture in ways that were still unfolding. The great Buddhist monasteries were centers of scholarship, art, and architecture. Buddhist themes dominated painting and sculpture. Buddhist festivals structured the calendar. Buddhist concepts had infiltrated Chinese philosophy so deeply that it was sometimes impossible to tell where Buddhism ended and Chinese thought began. It was in this context that Haitong's project made sense as more than just a local initiative. The building of the world's largest Buddha was not merely a response to a dangerous river. It was a statement about the place of Buddhist civilization in the 8th century world. It was an expression of confidence, of cultural vitality, of the conviction that the resources and the skill and the spiritual authority existed to do something that had never been done before. The Tang dynasty had the resources to build the Leshan Buddha because Tang China had developed agricultural techniques sophisticated enough to produce surpluses large enough to support massive non-agricultural projects. The chain from irrigated rice paddy to carved mountain god runs through the political economy of the dynasty. Without the surplus, there is no project. Without the project, there is no statue. The Tang also had the organizational capacity. By the 8th century, China had developed administrative systems capable of coordinating large-scale public works across the empire. The Grand Canal, which connected the northern and southern parts of China by water, was one of the largest infrastructure projects in human history, and it was built and maintained by the Tang administration. The Leshan Buddha was small by comparison, a local project in Sichuan rather than an empire-wide undertaking, but it benefited from the same general culture of large-scale organized effort that the Grand Canal represented. And the Tang had the sculptural tradition. Chinese Buddhist sculpture had been developing for centuries before Haitong arrived at the Leshan Cliff. The cave temples of Dunhuang, the Longmen Grottos, the Yungang Grottos. These were all major sculptural projects that preceded Leshan and established the technical and artistic traditions from which the Leshan workers drew. The knowledge of how to carve large-scale Buddhist figures in stone existed, had been refined over generations, had been transmitted through the communities of craftsmen who moved from one project to another across the breadth of the dynasty. Haitong did not invent large-scale Buddhist rock carving. He scaled it up. He took a tradition that had produced figures measured in dozens of feet and pushed it to produce a figure measured in hundreds. The jump was quantitative, but the quantitative jump was large enough to produce something qualitatively new, something that the river actually responded to, something that is still there. Let's talk about what actually happened to the river. The standard explanation, the one you will find in every guidebook and every Wikipedia entry, is that the rock debris dumped into the river during construction raised the riverbed, altered the depth profile, and thereby reduced the severity of the whirlpools and dangerous currents that had made the confluence so deadly. This is probably correct as far as it goes, but it is worth examining in more detail, because the physics involved are more interesting than a simple statement of the effect conveys. Rivers at confluences behave in complex ways. When two rivers meet, the dynamics of their interaction depend on the relative velocities of the two streams, their angles of intersection, their respective depths, the shape of the riverbed at the meeting point, and the seasonal variation in all of these factors. At the Leshan confluence, where three rivers meet rather than two, the dynamics are correspondingly more complex. The dangerous whirlpools that Haitong was trying to address were almost certainly the result of specific features of the riverbed at the confluence. The geometry of the underwater topography, the specific arrangement of rocks and shoals and depth variations. was creating conditions where the interacting currents produced persistent rotating water structures that were hazardous to navigation. When you add material to the riverbed, you change its geometry. You raise the bed, you alter the angles at which currents interact. You potentially break up the specific spatial arrangement of features that was producing the dangerous conditions. Whether adding rock debris to a particular spot will improve or worsen conditions at a river confluence is not something you can predict from first principles without detailed knowledge of the specific hydraulic situation you are dealing with. The fact that it worked suggests two possibilities. The first is that the workers simply added so much material to the river that any dangerous configuration of the riverbed was physically overwhelmed. You dumped millions of cubic feet of rock into the water, and the resulting change to the bed was too large and too comprehensive for any particular hazardous feature to survive it. This is the brute force explanation. The second, more interesting possibility is that Haitong understood, at some level, exactly what he was doing. That his choice of where to carve, which cliff face, which orientation of the figure, which direction the debris would naturally fall into the river, was not arbitrary. That he had studied the confluence long enough to understand where in the river the problem features were, and had chosen his carving site accordingly so that the debris would fall precisely where it would do the most good. The historical sources do not confirm this interpretation. Haitong's motivations are recorded in religious terms. He wanted to place a figure of the Buddha at the confluence to protect travelers on the water. Whether he had any explicit understanding of the hydraulic mechanism is not recorded, but he was not a naive person. He had lived in Sichuan, which meant he lived in a landscape defined by water management. The agriculture of the Sichuan Basin depended on the irrigation system known as Dujiangyan, one of the most sophisticated water management systems in the ancient world, built in the 3rd century BC and still functioning today. Any educated person in Sichuan in the 8th century would have grown up in a culture that understood rivers, that understood how human intervention in river systems could alter their behavior, that had a deep, practical vocabulary for thinking about water. Haitong may not have used the language of hydraulic engineering, but he may have understood the principles well enough to choose his site for reasons that he expressed in religious terms, but that were also, simultaneously, engineering reasons. The religious framework and the engineering framework were not in conflict. They were parallel descriptions of the same decision. This is one of the things that makes the Leshan Buddha philosophically interesting, rather than merely historically interesting. It raises the question of how many ancient religious projects were simultaneously engineering projects. How many monuments built for spiritual reasons were also solutions to practical problems, and whether the people who built them understood both dimensions at once, or only one. At Leshan, the evidence strongly suggests both. 90 years of construction. Let's try to understand what that actually means. A modern large construction project of comparable ambition, a major dam, a suspension bridge across a large river, a skyscraper of record height, typically takes between 10 and 20 years from initial conception to completion. These projects have steel, concrete, power tools, precision surveying equipment, computer-aided design, and workforces of thousands of specialists, drawing on the accumulated engineering knowledge of the industrial age. 90 years for a project without any of these things is not evidence of incompetence or lack of ambition. It is evidence of the reality of pre-modern construction at the largest scales. The Leshan Buddha was carved in the 8th and early 9th centuries using iron chisels, hammers, and hand-pulled rope systems for moving debris. The workers were organized into teams that addressed different sections of the figure simultaneously, but the number of workers who could be active at any given time was limited by the available scaffolding positions, the capacity of the debris removal operation, and the logistics of feeding and housing a large workforce on the steep slope of Mount Lingyun. The construction proceeded from top to bottom. The head was carved first, then the body, then the hands and knees, then the feet. This sequencing was not arbitrary. The head is at the top of the cliff and could be accessed most easily from above. Working from top to bottom also meant that as the figure descended, the carved sections above provided stable anchor points for the scaffolding needed for lower sections. More importantly, starting from the top meant that the most prominent and most sacred part of the figure, the head and face, was completed and visible to the public while work continued below. This was psychologically important. For a project that needed sustained public support and continued donations over decades, having the Buddha's face present and watching over the river from an early stage in the construction maintained the sense of spiritual investment that kept money and workers coming. The face of the Leshan Buddha is 48 feet long from chin to crown. The eyes are 11 feet wide when open, which gives the figure a gaze of enormous, unhurried width. The expression is one that Buddhist sculptors had been developing for centuries. The specific combination of compassion and detachment that characterizes the fully enlightened mind. Not happy, exactly. Not sad, not passive, present, aware, attending. The workers who carved the face were working on scaffolding at the level of the upper cliff, their tools chiseling into the red sandstone to produce features that, from their working position, must have appeared as abstract contours and depths, rather than the recognizable face that emerges when you step back far enough to see the whole. This is one of the most interesting aspects of large-scale carving work. The artisans doing the detailed work cannot see what they are making in the way that the finished object will be seen. They are working in close-up on what will eventually be experienced at a distance. The knowledge of what the finished figure will look like, translated into instructions for each specific cut of the chisel, is something that exists in the mind of the designer, transmitted to the workers through templates, guides, and careful instruction. The consistency of the Leshan Buddha's proportions, the fact that the figure reads as correct, as well scaled, as having the right relationships between its parts when seen from the river, is evidence that this translation from design, intent, to execution was managed well. The supervisors who held the mental model of the finished figure in their minds for 90 years and transmitted it clearly enough to multiple generations of workers achieved something that architectural historians of every tradition find impressive. They produced a figure at a scale no one had built before and got the proportions right. There are no practice runs at this scale. You can't build a 2-3-3-foot figure and decide the proportions are wrong and try again. The design had to be right before construction began, and it had to stay right across 9 decades and multiple leadership changes. It was right. For most of its history, the Leshan Buddha was not exposed to the elements in the way we see it today. When the figure was completed in 803 AD, it was enclosed in a wooden pavilion, a 13-story structure built around and above the seated figure, protecting the carved stone from rain, wind, and the biological processes of moss and lichen growth that accelerate erosion in moist climates. The pavilion would have been enormous, a wooden structure 13 stories tall, built to enclose a seated figure that is itself 71 meters high. This was not a small addition to the project. It was an engineering achievement in its own right, a wooden building of a scale comparable to the largest timber structures of its era. It would also have completely changed the visual character of the site. Instead of the red sandstone figure emerging from the cliff face, visible from miles away on the river, travelers would have seen a massive wooden building on the side of the mountain. The Buddha would have been interior to this building, accessible through a doorway, experienced in a shelter rather than in the open. The pavilion stood for several centuries. The historical sources mention it as a notable feature of the site. Travelers and pilgrims who described visiting Leshan in the Tang and early Song periods described the pavilion as part of the experience of the place. Then it burned. The specific date and cause of the fire that destroyed the pavilion are not recorded with certainty. What the records indicate is that by the time the Song dynasty was documenting the Leshan site in the 10th and 11th centuries, the pavilion was gone. The Buddha was exposed. The red sandstone was open to the sky. And here is the thing about that loss. It was in some ways a transformation rather than a simple destruction. The figure that most people see today, the great stone Buddha emerging from the cliff face, visible from the river, present in the landscape as a geological feature rather than a hidden treasure inside a building, is a different kind of monument from what Haitong originally built. The original conception was more intimate, a protected interior experience, an encounter with the Buddha in a sheltered space, perhaps lit by the oil lamps that Buddhist shrines used, perhaps perfumed with incense, perhaps attended by resident monks who could explain what you were seeing. The contemporary experience is a different register entirely. The openness, the scale visible from miles away, the figure as part of the landscape rather than sheltered from it. The weathering of the stone, which gives it a color and texture that smooth, freshly carved stone doesn't have. The plants growing from the figure's hair, the birds that nest in the folds of the robes, all of these are the result of the loss of the pavilion. They are the result of 1,200 years of exposure to the Sichuan climate, and they have made the figure, in some ways, more powerful as a visual and spiritual experience than the enclosed version might have been. The weathering has given the figure a quality that new construction never has, the quality of having endured, of having been here through things, of having watched the river change, and the dynasties rise and fall, and the boats become different in design, and the travelers different in their clothing, while remaining absolutely itself. The pavilion's loss was a loss, but what emerged from that loss was something that the original builder did not design and could not have anticipated, a figure that had become part of the landscape, that belonged to the mountain and the river and the sky, rather than to any particular human construction around it. That, too, is a kind of completion. 1,200 years is a long time. In 803 AD, when the Leshan Buddha was completed, the Tang dynasty was past its peak. The devastating Lushan rebellion of 755 to 763, one of the most destructive events in Chinese history, had killed tens of millions of people and permanently weakened the central authority of the dynasty. The cosmopolitan confidence of Xuanzong's reign had been replaced by a more anxious, more contracted version of Tang imperial culture, still impressive by the standards of the age, but no longer the supreme expression of civilization that it had been. The Buddha watched the Tang decline and collapse in 907. It watched the period of fragmentation that followed, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms era. When China broke into multiple competing states and the coherent imperial project of the Tang gave way to several generations of smaller ambitions and violent transitions, it watched the Song dynasty consolidate power and produce another flowering of Chinese civilization, different from the Tang in character, perhaps more inward, more philosophical, more focused on the refinement of what already existed rather than the acquisition of what was new, but equally impressive in its own register. It watched the Mongol invasion of the 13th century that ended the Song and established the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. The Mongols were not Buddhists in the Chinese sense, though they were generally tolerant of the religions of their subjects, and the Leshan Buddha was not destroyed during the conquest. But the world around it changed completely, as it always does when an empire falls and another rises. It watched the Ming dynasty, the restoration of Chinese rule after the Mongols, another period of cultural achievement and construction that left its own marks on the Leshan site. It watched the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, which governed China from 1644 to 1912, and left the site in its current condition through a combination of preservation efforts and simple neglect. It watched the modern era, the Republican period, the Japanese occupation of Sichuan during World War II, the Communist Revolution of 1949, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s that destroyed so many Buddhist sites across China. The Leshan Buddha survived the Cultural Revolution. This is not entirely obvious. The Cultural Revolution, under the influence of Maoist ideology, targeted Buddhist religious sites as expressions of feudal superstition. The Red Guards who traveled across China, destroying temples, burning scripture collections, and defacing religious images, did enormous damage to China's Buddhist heritage. At Leshan, the figure was saved partly by its scale, partly by its designation as a tourist site rather than an active religious site, and partly by the efforts of local people who found ways to protect the figure from the attention of the most destructive elements of the Cultural Revolution. The specifics of how the figure survived this period are not fully documented, but survive it did. Today, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It receives several million visitors per year. The boats that pass below the feet carry not merchants and their cargo, but tourists with cameras. The river has been tamed not just by the rock debris of 1,200 years ago, but by a modern dam system that regulates the flow in ways that Haitong could not have imagined. The figure has watched all of this, the transitions of power, the changes in technology, the transformation of the river from a route of trade to a tourist attraction, the evolution of the landscape from a productive agricultural region to an increasingly urbanized province. It is watched without moving, without changing its gaze, without shifting the position of its hands on its knees or the direction of its attention toward the water where it has always looked. In a world where everything changes, the figure is one of the things that doesn't. There is something in that constancy that people have been responding to for 12 centuries. The reassurance of something that was there before you and will be there after you. The comfort of permanence in an impermanent world. The Buddhist tradition has a particular resonance here. The Buddha is, in Buddhist theology, a figure who has achieved liberation from the cycle of change that characterizes ordinary existence. The statue embodies this theologically. It also embodies it physically. Stone does not age in the way that flesh ages. The figure at Leshan looks, within the limits of natural weathering, very much as it looked when it was completed in 803. The Tang Dynasty residents who first encountered it, and you, arriving by tourist boat in the 21st century, have an experience of essentially the same thing, the same face, the same eyes, the same unhurried gaze toward the river. That continuity is extraordinary. It is one of the things that makes the Leshan Buddha not just a large stone figure, but a genuine cultural monument in the deepest sense. Something that has been a site of meaning for people across a span of time so long that it transcends any particular historical moment. Let's talk about the hair in more detail. Because the hair of the Leshan Buddha is one of the most technically interesting aspects of the entire figure, and it is the part that most visitors, looking from the river, but least understand. The Buddha's hair appears from a distance as a series of large curls or coils arranged across the crown of the head. This is a standard iconographic feature of large Buddhist figures. The hair coils, called Ushnisha in Sanskrit, are one of the 32 marks of a great being in Buddhist iconographic tradition. They represent the crown of the Buddha's wisdom, the physical manifestation of the mental heights he has attained. At Leshan, there are 1,021 hair coils. Each coil is approximately a meter in diameter. They are not carved in the same continuous stone as the rest of the head. They are attached elements, added to the carved head during construction. And they are, in their structural function, not hair at all. They are a drainage system disguised as hair. Each coil has channels carved into it that collect rainwater from the curved surface and direct it to larger channels that run between the coils. These larger channels merge into still larger channels that run down the back of the head to the main drainage system of the figure's body. The entire network of hair channels was designed as a first-line interceptor for rain, catching the water before it can run down the face of the figure and cause erosion or staining. This is technically brilliant. The iconographic requirement, the Buddha must have these specific coils in his hair, and the hydraulic requirement, the figure must shed water efficiently, have been solved by the same element. The hair is the drainage. The drainage is the hair. There is no compromise between the religious and the practical. They are the same thing. The builders who designed this had to understand two things simultaneously: Buddhist iconography in sufficient detail to know exactly what the hair coils needed to look like and how many of them there needed to be, and hydraulic engineering in sufficient detail to know how to channel water across a curved surface to specific collection points. They held both knowledge systems in mind at once and produced a solution that satisfies both requirements completely. This is the kind of synthesis that the Leshan Buddha rewards the more closely you look at it. Every aspect of the figure that appears to be purely religious turns out to have an engineering rationale. Every aspect that appears to be purely engineering turns out to serve the visual and spiritual composition of the figure. The hollow ears manage moisture inside the head, preventing freeze-thaw damage to the carved stone. They also contribute to the visual character of the figure, since slightly hollow ears are a feature of the iconographic tradition. The drainage channels in the shoulders carry water to the cliff face without staining the robe. They also follow the carved contours of the garment in ways that reinforce its visual character. The figure was designed holistically. Every element was considered in relation to every other element. The religious form and the engineering function were not separate design challenges solved separately and then reconciled. They were solved together as aspects of the same design problem. This is, in the vocabulary of contemporary design thinking, integration. The designers of the Leshan Buddha were integrative designers in a sense that most modern projects do not achieve. They had 1,000 years of practice at it. The Chinese Buddhist sculptural tradition had been developing precisely this kind of integration at smaller scales for centuries before Leshan. What Haitong and his successors did was take that tradition of integration and apply it at a scale that made the engineering demands so acute that only the most sophisticated possible design solutions would work. The scale forced the quality, and the quality has lasted 12 centuries. The eyes of the Leshan Buddha are open. This seems obvious, but it is a specific choice among available alternatives. Many Buddhist figures have closed or partially closed eyes, turned inward in meditation, suggesting an attention directed not at the external world, but at the inner landscape of consciousness. Leshan's Buddha looks outward. The eyes are open and directed down toward the river. The gaze is specific and intentional. This is not a figure absorbed in its own contemplation. This is a figure attending to the world. The direction of the gaze was chosen deliberately. The figure sits facing east, which means the face is oriented toward the river confluence. The downward angle of the gaze, the specific way the eyes are set in relation to the line of the brow and the slope of the face, means that the natural resting direction of the figure's attention is toward the water where the danger was. You can analyze this in several ways. In religious terms, the open, outward gaze of a Buddha figure represents not the stage of meditation, but the stage of compassionate action in the world. The fully enlightened mind, in Buddhist theology, does not retreat permanently from engagement with ordinary reality. It remains present and responsive to suffering. The open eyes of the Leshan Buddha say, "I see you. I see where you are going. I see the danger you are navigating." In psychological terms, the effect of a very large face with open eyes looking down at you from above is specific and well documented. It produces the feeling of being watched by something that has the scale to be indifferent but has chosen not to be. something that could look at mountains but has turned its gaze to you in your boat, navigating the water. In practical terms, the open gaze is important for another reason. The figure is most often approached from the river by boat. As you come down the river toward the confluence, the Buddha's face becomes visible before the body. The face is the first communication between the figure and the approaching traveler. The message that face sends is, "You have been seen. You are not alone on this water." Whether you are a Tang Dynasty merchant calculating the risk of navigating the confluence, or a 21st century tourist on an excursion boat, the effect of that gaze is the same. Something very large is paying attention to you specifically. Something that was here long before you and will be here long after you has chosen to direct its attention to your crossing of the water. The comfort in that is not rational. It doesn't make the water less dangerous in any physical sense. But the history of human beings navigating dangerous situations suggests that the comfort of not being alone, of being seen, is not nothing. It is, in fact, something that changes behavior. People who feel watched over take risks more deliberately. People who feel invisible take risks carelessly. Haitong wanted to reduce the death toll on the river. He built a figure that watched the river. The watching, the felt presence of attention, was part of the mechanism. Combine that with the engineering effect of the rock debris in the water, and you have a two-pronged solution to the problem. Change the hydraulic environment of the confluence, and change the psychological environment of the people navigating it. Both prongs used the same tool, carving the mountain into a god. Both prongs worked. The red sandstone of Mount Lingyun is alive in ways that stone is not usually described as alive. Not alive in the biological sense, though there is plenty of biological life in and on the carved surface. Mosses, lichens, ferns, grasses growing from cracks in the rock, insects nesting in the folds of the carved robe, birds building in the recesses of the carved hair, alive in the sense that it is continuously changing. The geological processes that form the sandstone continue to affect it. The chemical weathering of the iron-rich minerals that give the stone its red color produces ongoing change in the surface texture. Rain infiltrates microfractures and expands them through freeze-thaw cycling in the winters when temperatures at Leshan drop low enough for freezing. The biological organisms living on the surface produce acids that slowly dissolve the calcium carbonate, binding the sand grains of the stone together. The sandstone is eroding. This is not a crisis, but a reality. All stone erodes. The question for the conservation of the Leshan Buddha is not whether it erodes, but at what rate. Whether that rate is stable or accelerating, and what can be done to slow it without causing other kinds of damage. The Chinese government has invested substantially in the conservation of the figure. Teams of conservators have worked on the surface for decades, treating biological growth with biocides, repairing surface cracks with compatible stone consolidants, managing the drainage system to ensure it continues to function effectively, and monitoring the rate of erosion with instruments that detect changes in the surface geometry over time. There have been controversies in this conservation work. Some of the treatments applied to the figure over the years have been criticized by later conservators as inadequate or harmful. The application of chemical consolidants in earlier decades, for example, created surface crusts that in some cases trapped moisture behind them and accelerated rather than retarded the erosion they were meant to prevent. The conservation of a 1,200-year-old rock carving in a subtropical climate with several million visitors per year is genuinely difficult. The challenges include not just the weathering of the stone itself, but the effects of air pollution from the heavily industrialized Sichuan province, the physical vibration of tourist boats passing at close distance, the humidity introduced by large numbers of people in proximity to the figure, and the difficulty of applying any treatment to a surface that cannot safely be scaffolded without enormous cost and risk. But there is something more interesting than the conservation challenges. which are shared with many other ancient sites. The Leshan Buddha's specific relationship with its geological context, the fact that it is not a separate object placed in a landscape, but a portion of the landscape itself that has been shaped into a figure, means that the boundary between the figure and the mountain is not clear. Where does the statue end and the cliff begin? The face is the statue, the ears are the statue, the hair is the statue, but the cliff behind the head, which continues up and over the crown, is also the statue's support structure. The platform on which the feet rest is both part of the figure and part of the cliff. The drainage channels cut into the body eventually lead to channels cut into the cliff face and into the riverbank. The figure is not detachable from its site. It is its site. The mountain and the god are the same thing, and the same geological processes that shape the mountain are shaping the god. This is both a conservation challenge and a philosophical point. The Leshan Buddha will not be moved to a museum. It will not be preserved in controlled atmospheric conditions. It will weather with a mountain, change with a mountain, and eventually, on a geological timescale that dwarfs human history, erode back into the mountain from which it was carved. The impermanence that Buddhist philosophy teaches, the doctrine that all conditioned phenomena are temporary, applies to the figure as much as to anything else. The monks and conservators who care for it are not trying to prevent its impermanence. They are trying to extend its duration to ensure that the meeting of human attention and geological material that produce this figure lasts as long as it can within the constraints of natural process. There is something deeply Buddhist about that approach, not fighting the nature of things, working with them, extending what is possible without pretending that permanence is achievable. The figure was carved out of the natural world. It will, in its own time, return to it. In August 2020, the worst flooding in 7 decades hit Sichuan province. The rivers that converge at Leshan, the Min, the Dadu, and the Qingyi, rose to levels that had not been seen since 1949. The water level at the confluence climbed until it reached the feet of the Buddha for the first time in living memory, and then it climbed further. The waters rose to the level of the Buddha's knees. This had happened only 3 times in recorded history, once in the Tang dynasty, once in the Ming, once in the Qing. Each time, the historical sources treated it as a significant omen. The flooding of the Buddha's feet and knees was understood as a message from the earth itself, a sign that something had exceeded proper limits, that the balance between the human world and the natural world had been disturbed. In 2020, the floodwaters reached the Buddha's knees on August 18th. Within a few days, they had receded. The figure was undamaged. The drainage systems that had managed water for 1,200 years continued to manage it. The stone that had been underwater for a few days dried out and showed no signs of accelerated damage. But the moment had meaning beyond its physical effects. The confluence at Leshan had, for most of the past 1,200 years, been substantially calmer than it was in Haitong's time. The combination of the rock debris from the original carving, subsequent human management of the rivers, and eventually, the modern dam systems of the 20th century had together transformed the nature of the water at the site. The killing whirlpools of the 8th century were gone. The river that had claimed so many lives before the Buddha was built had been tamed. The 2020 flood was a reminder that the taming was not permanent, that the relationship between the mountain and the rivers was not concluded, that the water, given sufficient provocation by rainfall and upstream conditions, could still reach the figure and remind it, and the people watching it, that the natural world had not ceded its authority to human engineering. The Buddha's knees were wet for a few days. The rivers calmed. The Buddha was still there. There is something in this that the Buddhist philosophical tradition would recognize. The figure represents the possibility of equanimity in the face of conditions that cannot be controlled. It does not fight the flood. It does not run from it. It sits, as it has always sat, with the same expression and the same gaze and the same hands on its knees, and it lets the water do what water does. And the water, as it always does, recedes. The people whose lives the Leshan Buddha was built to protect were boatmen. They were not famous people. They did not leave historical records of their own. Their names do not appear in the Tang Dynasty annals or in the local gazetteers of Sichuan. They were ordinary people doing a dangerous job in a world where the river was the road, and the road was sometimes fatal. They carried silk from the workshops of Chengdu to the markets of the wider empire. They carried salt from the salt wells that made Sichuan economically important. They carried grain and wood and pottery and all the other goods that a prosperous province produces and a connected empire distributes. They carried people, merchants, officials, monks, pilgrims, soldiers, scholars. They knew the river. They knew the dangerous stretch at the Leshan confluence. They had their own vocabulary for the specific features of the water that needed to be avoided, the particular whirlpools that were reliably dangerous, the shoals that shifted position with the season, the current patterns that looked safe on the surface but were treacherous below. They also had their prayers, the offerings they made at riverside shrines before entering the dangerous stretch, the specific invocations they used when navigating it, the rituals performed after a successful crossing, the mourning customs for those who didn't make it. When the Buddha was built and the river began to calm, these boatmen would have been the first to notice the change. Not in the dramatic before and after sense that a historical account suggests, but in the incremental way that river people notice things. Slightly fewer close calls, slightly more predictable behavior from the water, a slightly higher rate of everyone getting through. The change would have been attributed to the Buddha. Of course it would. The change coincided with the completion of the figure. The figure was built specifically to produce this result. The boatmen who saw the figure watching from the cliff would have connected the cause and the effect in the most natural possible way. And they would have been right. The connection between the figure and the change in the river was real. The causal mechanism was different from what the boatmen believed. Perhaps, or perhaps not so different. The physics of a changed riverbed and the metaphysics of a protective divine presence may not be as distinct as a modern rationalist would want them to be. But the connection was real. The Buddha was built for the boatmen. It was built by a monk whose name we know, funded by donors whose names we don't know, worked on by craftsmen whose names are mostly lost, completed by governors who took up the project after the founder died. All of this human effort, sustained over 90 years, was in service of a practical goal: reducing the death toll on a dangerous stretch of water. The boatmen are all dead now. The boats are different. The river is managed by engineers with computers. The goods that travel this region go by road and rail. But the figure is still there, still watching the water where the boatmen used to navigate, still attending to the confluence that was once the most dangerous stretch of river in Sichuan, still doing the job it was built to do, even though the job, strictly speaking, no longer needs doing. This is one of the most moving things about the Leshan Buddha. It outlasted the specific need it was built to address. The problem it was built to solve has been solved, not just by the figure itself, but by all the subsequent human management of the river system. The original boatmen are long gone. The original danger is greatly diminished. But the Buddha still watches, still attends, still offers whatever it offers to whoever is passing on the water below. The compassion that it was built to express has not run out. It was not issued for a specific period or for a specific need. It was carved into the mountain. It is the mountain's expression. It goes on. The Leshan Giant Buddha does not stand alone. Mount Lingyun, the cliff from which the figure was carved, is also home to Lingyun Temple, one of the oldest active Buddhist monasteries in Sichuan. The temple complex extends across the mountaintop above and around the Buddha, its buildings dating from the Tang Dynasty through the present, rebuilt and expanded by successive generations of monks. From the mountaintop, you can look down on the Buddha's head. The curled hair coils, 1,021 of them, are directly below you. The scale of the head from above is different from the scale from the river. From the river, the head is the most visible part, the part that resolves first as you approach. From above, the head is an architectural surface, a textured terrain of engineered stone. The temple contains relics, manuscripts, and devotional objects accumulated over 13 centuries. It has a library with texts that document the history of the site, including records of repairs to the Buddha in various dynasties and accounts of the floods that have tested the figure over the years. These records are one of the primary sources for the history of the site. The monks who live at Lingyun Temple maintain a continuous tradition of prayer and scholarship that reaches back to Haitong's time. They are the institutional descendants of the community that built the Buddha and the custodians of the tradition that has preserved it. Their daily liturgy includes specific prayers for the protection of travelers on the river, a practice that began when the river was genuinely dangerous and continues now that it is not. Across the river from Mount Lingyun, on the opposite bank, is Wuyu Temple, another Tang Dynasty monastery connected to the Leshan site. The two temples, one on the cliff with the Buddha and one across the water, are linked by a long tradition of pilgrimage. Making the crossing from one to the other, by boat, is itself an act of devotion, a small enactment of the larger crossing that the Buddha's presence was meant to protect. There is also, at the base of the cliff, a small stone chamber accessible through a tunnel cut into the rock at the foot of the Buddha. This chamber contains a colossal reclining Buddha figure carved in the same stone as the seated figure above it. The reclining Buddha, at 90 meters in length, is if anything even larger than the seated figure above, though its horizontal orientation makes it less visible and less immediately overwhelming to visitors. The presence of a reclining Buddha at the base of the seated Buddha creates a theological pairing that the Buddhist iconographic tradition would recognize. The seated Buddha represents the living presence of the enlightened mind in the world, engaged and attending. The reclining Buddha represents parinirvana, the final passing of the Buddha from the world, the ultimate condition of liberation from conditioned existence. Together, the two figures at Leshan represent the full span of the Buddhist account of an enlightened being, presence in the world and departure from it, compassionate engagement and final release. Whether this pairing was part of Haitong's original design or was added later is not entirely clear from the historical sources, but the combination is complete and profound, and it adds a dimension to the Leshan site that the seated figure alone does not contain. The site is, in its full extent, a complex document in stone of the Buddhist understanding of existence, presence, and liberation, carved into a mountain above the confluence of 3 rivers in the middle of China. Who comes to Leshan? The pilgrimage tradition at the site is as old as the site itself. From the moment the Buddha was completed in 803 AD, people traveled to see it. Tang Dynasty travel writing includes descriptions of the journey to Leshan, the approach by river, the experience of the figure's scale. The site was on the itinerary of educated travelers who wanted to experience the remarkable things that Sichuan had to offer. In the Tang and Song periods, most visitors were Chinese, from the surrounding province and from the broader empire. The site was known as a pilgrimage destination for Buddhists, and as a destination of cultural curiosity for the educated class generally. It was discussed in poetry. It was mentioned in geographical texts. It accumulated a literary tradition around it that is, itself, centuries old. Foreign visitors began appearing in the records later. Marco Polo passed through Sichuan in the 13th century and described its wonders, though his account does not specifically mention Leshan. Later, Western travelers, missionaries, and traders and diplomats who penetrated the Chinese interior in the 19th century left accounts of the site that brought it to the attention of European readers. The modern tourist era began in earnest in the second half of the 20th century, as China's economy developed and domestic tourism became accessible to ordinary people. The site now receives millions of visitors per year, making it one of the most visited heritage sites in China and one of the most visited ancient monuments in the world. The visitor experience has changed with the visitor numbers. The boats that once carried pilgrims along a dangerous river now run on fixed schedules, carrying tourists equipped with smartphones. The view from the river, the approach that was always the primary way of experiencing the figure, is now experienced by people who are simultaneously photographing it, researching it on the internet, and comparing it to photographs they saw before they left home. This is not a lament. The democratization of heritage, the ability of ordinary people to visit remarkable places that were once accessible only to the privileged or the determined, is genuinely good. More people have experienced the Leshan Buddha in the last 50 years than in the first 1,000 years of its existence. But there is something worth noting about the difference between the experience of a Tang Dynasty traveler approaching the Buddha by river for the first time and the experience of a 21st century tourist doing the same thing. The Tang traveler had no photographs, no prior descriptions that included images, no way of knowing what they were approaching until they were approaching it. The experience of scale, of the progressive resolution of the figure as the boat came closer, was genuinely and completely new. For the contemporary visitor, the figure is familiar before it is experienced. The photographs have been seen, the videos watched, the basic facts known. The experience of the site is the experience of confirming and enriching a prior knowledge rather than encountering something entirely unexpected. This changes the phenomenology. It changes what the experience means to have, whether the change is a diminishment or merely a difference is a matter of perspective. What does not change is the scale. No photograph adequately prepares you for the actual size of the figure. No video conveys the sense of proportion that you get when you are in a boat below the feet, looking up and understanding with your body rather than your mind how much stone is above you. The scale is the thing that photographs cannot contain, and the scale is the thing that Haitong built his monument around. 12 centuries of visitors, from Tang Dynasty pilgrims to 21st century tourists with their phones, have all had the same moment when the photographs became insufficient, and the actual presence of the figure became undeniable. That moment is unchanged. That is what lasts. There is a question at the heart of the Leshan Buddha that is never quite answered, that the historical sources approach but do not resolve, that the figure itself poses to anyone who spends time thinking about it. Did Haitong know what he was doing? Not in the sense of knowing how to carve a figure of this scale, which clearly he and his successors did know or learned in the course of the project. In the more fundamental sense, did he know that carving the figure would change the river? Did he choose the site, the cliff, the orientation, the scale, with an understanding of the hydraulic effect that the rock debris would have? Was the engineering intentional, planned, predicted? Or did he simply build a religious monument, and the hydraulic effect was an unintended consequence, a fortunate coincidence, a gift that arrived alongside the spiritual purpose, but was not part of its design? The honest answer is that we don't know. The historical sources describe Haitong's motivation in religious terms. He wanted to calm the river through the spiritual power of the Buddha's presence. He wanted the Buddha's compassion to extend to the boatmen navigating the dangerous confluence. There is no surviving document in which Haitong describes having thought through the hydraulic effects of carving a large figure above the confluence and dumping the debris into the water. But the absence of documentation is not the same as the absence of knowledge. In 8th century China, as in many traditional cultures, technical knowledge was often not written down, was transmitted through apprenticeship and practice rather than through text, and was embedded in practical and ritual frameworks that expressed it in terms that modern readers classify as religious rather than technical. Haitong may have known that the debris would help the river without having the conceptual vocabulary to express that knowledge in terms we would recognize as engineering. He may have described the mechanism in terms of spiritual power while understanding, at some practical level, that the physical change to the riverbed was the proximate cause of the improvement. Or he may have been purely motivated by faith, and the engineering effect may have been coincidental. Either way, the effect was real. Either way, it worked. And this is the deeper question that Leshan poses. When we look at religious projects from the ancient and medieval world, how often are we dealing with cases like this one, where the religious framework and the practical engineering are not in conflict but are parallel descriptions of the same thing? How often did ancient builders solve practical problems that they understood in religious terms, and what do we lose by translating those solutions into purely secular technical language? The Leshan Buddha is not improved by being explained as hydraulic engineering. It is not diminished by being explained as religious devotion. It is both, simultaneously, completely, in a way that resists the modern tendency to separate the technical from the sacred. Haitong stood at the top of the cliff and looked down at the river. He saw a problem. He conceived a solution. The solution was a god carved from the mountain. The god and the engineering were the same thing. That synthesis is the deepest wisdom of the Leshan Buddha. Not its scale, though the scale is extraordinary. Not its engineering, though the engineering is sophisticated. Not its longevity, though the longevity is remarkable. The deepest wisdom is that it understood something that our era struggles to hold on to. That the practical and the sacred, the technical and the devotional, the engineering and the faith, are not necessarily different things. That the most effective solutions to difficult problems are sometimes the ones that address both dimensions at once. Haitong built a god to calm a river. The god calmed the river. The mountain knows this. The river knows this. The people who have been passing below for 12 centuries, looking up at the figure that watches the water, know this in their bodies, even if they can't articulate it. Some things work because they are true. There is a second way to see the Leshan site, one that most visitors don't experience, one that requires a longer walk and a different perspective. If you climb the mountain behind the Buddha, past the temple complex on the summit, and continue along the ridge, you eventually reach a point from which you can see the entire Mount Lingyun Massif from a significant distance, from high above and to one side. From this perspective, something becomes visible that is invisible from the river. The topography of the entire mountain, when seen from this angle, appears to form the shape of a reclining figure. The summit ridgeline suggests a head. The slope below suggests a chest and folded hands. The lower portions of the mountain resolve into legs. The Leshan Giant Buddha, the carved seated figure, is positioned at what would be the chest of this larger reclining form. This is not a universally accepted reading of the landscape. Some observers see it clearly, others don't see it at all, attributing the apparent figure to pareidolia, the human tendency to find faces and figures in random natural forms. But the tradition at Leshan supports the reading. Local folklore has long maintained that Mount Lingyun is itself a sleeping Buddha, that the mountain is a body in repose, and that the carved figure is the visible heart of a larger sacred form that the mountain embodies in its entirety. If you accept this reading, even provisionally, the Leshan site becomes something considerably more complex than a large stone figure carved into a cliff. It becomes an interaction between two Buddhas, the one carved by human hands, 233 feet tall, made by 90 years of labor, visible and immediate, and the one formed by geological process, across millions of years, enormous and barely legible, perceptible only from the right distance and the right angle. The human-made figure sits at the heart of the geological figure. The carved and the natural, the intentional and the accidental, The work of a monk and his successors, and the work of continental drift and volcanic deposition converge at the same point on the same cliff, above the same confluence of three rivers. Whether Haitong chose his site because he saw this larger form in the mountain, or whether the alignment is genuinely coincidental, is another question the historical record cannot answer. But the question itself is worth sitting with. The possibility that the site was chosen because someone, standing at this ridge and looking down at the mountain, saw what the mountain was already and decided to reveal what was already there, is consistent with everything we know about how Haitong thought about his project. He was not, by his own account, inventing something new. He was making visible what was already true. The mountain was already a Buddha. He just carved it into the cliff so everyone could see. If you are using this to fall asleep, here's what I want you to think about as you go. The Leshan Buddha is watching the river right now. Not metaphorically, physically. The stone figure that Haitong began in 713 AD is sitting in its seat above the confluence of three rivers in Sichuan province, China, with its eyes open and directed at the water, as it has been every moment since it was completed in 803 AD. It is 3 inches the morning in Sichuan right now, or close to it. The river is moving in the dark below the cliff. The lights of the modern city of Leshan are on the banks. The tourist boats are docked. The temple above the figure is quiet. The monks asleep except for whoever is keeping the night watch that has been kept in some form since the Tang dynasty. The figure is sitting in the dark, which is to say it is doing what it always does, only without the daytime spectators. The water moves below. The figure sits above. Nothing is required of anyone. In 1,200 years, the figure has seen the world change in ways that would be incomprehensible to the person who began it. The dynasty that built it, the dynasties that followed, the technologies, the wars, the revolutions, the invention of photography, which captured it for the first time in the 19th century, the invention of airplanes, which allowed it to be seen from above for the first time, the invention of the internet, which allowed its image to be distributed to everyone on Earth instantly. Through all of this, the figure sat. The expression on the face didn't change. The gaze didn't shift. The hands on the knees didn't move. This is what large stone figures do. They endure. They persist through things. They become, over time, not just monuments but witnesses, presences that have seen more than any living thing can see. The Leshan Buddha has been watching the water for 1,200 years. It has watched the boats change from wooden junks to motor vessels to tourist excursion boats. It has watched the river levels rise and fall with seasons and floods and droughts. It has watched the surrounding landscape transform from Tang Dynasty farmland to modern city. And in the morning, when the tourist boats begin running again, the people who come by river will have the same experience that Tang Dynasty travelers had. The approach by water, the progressive resolution of the figure as the boat comes closer, the moment when scale becomes undeniable, the gaze that has been watching the water since before your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were born. That gaze is unchanged. That is the gift of the Leshan Buddha to everyone who encounters it across 12 centuries. Not wisdom, not salvation, not engineering, just presence. Just the companionship of something that has been here longer than you and will be here after you, that saw the river before it was tamed and will see the river after the dams are gone, that watches without agenda, attends without judgment, sits in its seat above the water and requires nothing of you except that you notice it. Notice it. It carved itself out of the mountain for you, for the boatmen who are long dead, yes, but also for you, for whoever is on the water, for whoever needs something larger than the danger to be present. It's still there. Go to sleep. The river is quiet tonight. The Buddha is watching. You are safe. Let's return to the engineering one more time. because there is something in the numbers that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The volume of rock removed to carve the Leshan Buddha, including the seated figure, the cliff trenches on either side that give the figure its freestanding character, and the surrounding decorative elements, is estimated at approximately 1.2 million cubic meters. That is roughly 42 million cubic feet. Put differently, 1.2 million cubic meters of solid sandstone, removed by hand tools over 90 years, dumped into a river. The river, which had been killing people at the confluence for as long as anyone could remember, became substantially safer. Now, the engineers of the Tang Dynasty did not have surveying equipment capable of measuring the underwater topography of the river with the precision that modern hydrological science requires to predict how a change in the riverbed will affect flow dynamics. They could not have run a simulation. They could not have calculated in advance how much rock dumped in which locations would produce what change in the behavior of the water. And yet the change happened. The rock went into the water. The dangerous conditions diminished. 3 possibilities. The first, coincidence. The risk of the confluence was already diminishing for natural reasons, perhaps a gradual change in the sediment load of the rivers, and the improvement that was attributed to the Buddha's construction was actually a pre-existing trend. The second, brute force. They put so much rock into the river, 42 million cubic feet over 90 years, that any hazardous feature of the riverbed was physically overwhelmed. The change was not engineered. It was inevitable given the volume. The third, knowledge. Haitong and his successors understood the confluence well enough to know that adding material in this particular place would change the dangerous conditions. The knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, the knowledge of a person who had studied a specific river over a long period, not the knowledge of a hydrologist with equations and instruments. But it was knowledge nonetheless, and it produced a correct prediction. The first possibility seems unlikely given the consistency of the historical record. The dangerous confluence is documented repeatedly before the construction and not mentioned as a major hazard after it. The change coincides too closely with the construction to be easily explained as a pre-existing trend. The second and third possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Haitong may have understood, at some practical level, that the site he chose would put rock in the right places to improve the confluence, and the sheer volume of rock that went in over 90 years would have reinforced and extended whatever effect the targeted placement achieved. What we can say with confidence is this: a monk decided to carve a mountain into a god, and in the course of doing so, changed the behavior of a river that had been killing people for centuries. The change was documented by the people who lived through it. It has been studied by modern hydrologists who confirm that it is hydraulically plausible. It is a result of a project motivated by religious conviction, executed over 90 years, at a scale that had no precedent. The mystery is not why it worked. The physics are clear enough. The mystery is how a monk in 713 AD, without instruments, without formulas, without any of the tools of modern engineering, arrived at a project that would work. The answer the historical sources give is that he was shown. The answer that modern rationalism prefers is that he was observant and smart and happened to be right. The answer that the Buddha itself suggests, sitting in its seat above the river with its eyes open and its hands on its knees, watching the water that it has watched for 12 centuries, is that perhaps those two answers are not as different as we think. What do you take from Leshan? Not the statistics, though the statistics are extraordinary. Not the engineering, though the engineering is sophisticated and impressive and still working after 12 centuries. Not the history, though the history spans a range of dynasties and transformations that makes the human past feel both vast and navigable. What you take from Leshan is an image, one specific image that stays with you. A monk stood at the top of a cliff in 713 AD and looked down at the river that was killing people. He had no power in the usual sense. He had no army, no money, no political authority. He was one person with a vision and a conviction. He decided to carve a god out of the mountain. The god took 90 years to complete. The monk died before it was finished. The project outlasted him because the conviction he had built into it was strong enough to sustain it without him. When the god was finished, the river calmed. The boatman lived who would otherwise have died. The god has been watching the river ever since. In a world that tends to celebrate rapid solutions, technology-driven answers, the quick fix, the disruption, the scalable platform, there is something quietly radical about the Leshan Buddha. It is a solution that took 90 years to implement. It was built by people using hand tools. Its mechanism of action involved both the spiritual and the physical simultaneously. Its designer died before it was finished. And it worked. For 12 centuries, it has been working. There are solutions in the world today that we need and cannot yet see. Problems that seem as intractable as a river confluence that kills people every year. Situations where the available tools seem inadequate to the scale of what needs to change. The Leshan Buddha suggests that the inadequacy of the available tools is not always the decisive constraint. Sometimes the decisive constraint is conviction, the decision to begin, and the organizational capacity to sustain the beginning until it becomes a completion, even if the completion comes after you are gone. Haitong did not know when he began in 713 that he would not live to see the figure finished, or if he knew, he began anyway. That is the other thing the Leshan Buddha is, a monument to the willingness to begin something you may not finish, in service of something that matters more than your own completion of it. The river mattered, the boatman mattered, the god was the tool available. He carved it. You are listening to this tonight, in whatever place and time you are in, and the Leshan Buddha is sitting above the river in Sichuan, exactly where it has been sitting since 803 AD. It is not going anywhere. The river is quiet tonight. The god is watching. Sleep well. The Min River moves through the darkness at Leshan tonight, the way it has moved through every darkness since before the cliff above it was carved. The water does not remember the whirlpools that Haitong saw. It does not remember the boatmen who drowned in the centuries before 713 AD. It does not remember the 90 years of construction, the sound of iron chisels on sandstone, the shouts of workers on bamboo scaffolding, the splash of excavated rock entering the water in loads that slowly, over decades, change the shape of the riverbed. The water just moves. It is doing now what it was doing when Haitong stood above it and made his decision. The same water, replenished continuously from the Tibetan snowfields and the Sichuan rain, moving through a landscape that has changed around it while it remained what it always was. The Buddha above the river is also doing what it has always done, sitting, attending, watching the confluence with the same eyes that first opened on this water 12 centuries ago, in the years when the Tang dynasty was still the greatest civilization on earth, and the boatmen of Sichuan were just learning that the dangerous stretch was becoming safer. If you were here tonight, standing on the bank of the river below the cliff, you would see the cliff first. The red sandstone in the darkness, lit only by the reflected light of the city downstream. Then, as your eyes adjusted, you would begin to see the shape within the cliff, the curve of the shoulder, the line of the ear, the mass of the head against the darker sky. And then you would see the eyes, open, directed downward, toward the water, toward you. In 713 AD, a monk stood above this river and decided that a god was needed here. He was right. The god is still here. Good night.